Today, let's talk about my daily indicator setup. Even though I hate indicators, there are some indicators that will help my analysis and improve my efficiency when I trade. We will talk about best TradingView indicators that I found the most useful. I'll also talk about how to set the indicators. It will be a great video for everyone who wants to speed their analysis. Let's start now. Since I get many questions about which indicators that I use regularly, I will reveal the indicators that I use every day. My first and the most used indicator is definitely key level indicator called key level spaceman. This is a very nice and simple indicator which helps me mark out all institutional levels instantly. As for the settings, I use merge levels, which merges close specific price levels. I use the global text shorthand, which will shorten the text labels. It will be more compact. And I also use the global coloring. All lines will be a single color on my chart. For the global colors, I generally use the gray colors with 50% transparency. For the main settings, first of all, I do not use 4-hour based levels. I mostly focus on daily and above levels, using the open value, previous day, high, low, and middle, basically the EQ value. I also keep the Monday range. These settings are also the same with weekly, monthly, and yearly levels. I do not use quarterly levels so much, it is just my personal preference. I also do not use the FX sessions on this indicator, I use another indicator for this. So when you open your chart and activate this indicator, it will look like this. It will show you all the critical institutional levels at once, without going any extra trouble finding them yourself. For example, current year high and the previous week high at the top, very interesting levels to watch in the future. Or previous day low, Monday low, and the previous weekly low. Together, another interesting area to watch where the liquidity gathers. So these indicators makes your life much quicker to find critical levels. Remember, efficiency is really important when it comes to trading. My second indicator is definitely the imbalance detector from Lux Algo. This is a very simple and an easy to use indicator. You do not have to use this one, I just enjoy it. My settings quite simple. I use all inefficiency types. Fair value gaps, basically imbalances, opening gaps, which shows large price gaps on the price, and the volume imbalances. Again, I mostly use gray colors with half transparency, so it will look clean and neat on my charts without causing so much distraction for me. As you can see, we do not need to go into further detail on this indicator. You should be an imbalance expert by now. It simply notifies me of the imbalance areas on the chart with a very transparent approach. As you can see, it never bothers me so much, but creates awareness that there are imbalance areas. So I do not need to find them one by one myself. My third indicator is actually another imbalance indicator called imbalance zone. Now you may wonder why in the world do I use two imbalance indicators at the same time? Do not worry, I will explain it soon. This is a very simple indicator with simple settings. You can copy and paste the settings from here. And my color choice is again very low transparent gray based colors. Now you asked why I use this second imbalance indicator. It is all because it beams the imbalances to the current price like a laser beam. What is the advantage of this? I do not need to search all the imbalances at top or bottom of the current price. I do not need to open the left of the chart all the time to find imbalances. It shows me all needed imbalances, as you can see. Basically, it saves me a huge time here, and it makes me aware there is an imbalance above or the bottom of my current price. It also makes finding targets so much easier. I can quickly combine liquidity and imbalance combo targets, which I love so much. My fourth indicator is the round number levels indicator. Actually, to be honest, there is no decent round number indicator on the market. But this one does the job well, without problems. It is an extremely simple indicator. The most important thing is this number, the rounding value. Since I mostly trade the Bitcoin, I look for every $1,000 level, such as $40,000, then $41,000, and then $42,000. But if you trade other pairs like the Forex market, this number will be much smaller. I again use low, transparent levels for the colors. Now, as you can see, when you open this indicator, it shows the round number levels very briefly on the chart. Now, it may look to you very brief and transparent, but this is the way I like it. My main focus is always the price itself. The rest is secondary. This is why I keep my indicator colors transparent. You can see that it shows 40K, 41K, 42K, and the 43K levels on the chart, which will magnetically pull the price to itself. Price generally break out when the price is extremely close these levels. The next indicator is FX market sessions. I basically look for Asia and London session highs and lows with this indicator. It is actually a bit of a complex indicator, but I only use some little parts of it. First of all, you must make sure that your UTC or GMT value is aligned with your TradingView and both set for the New York local time frame, which is currently UTC minus 5. So my Asia setting is set to 20 p.m. to noon, as you can see on the settings. Everything else is checked no. My London setting is set to 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. and everything else is set to no as well. I do not use any other session settings. At the bottom, I only have selected background colors. So the indicator will show me a little box on the charts. I also have the name label checked so I can see the labels over the boxes. One more last thing. In the visibility tab, my visibility is set to 15 minutes. So if I open time frames above 15 minutes, this indicator will be hidden. I don't want to check sessions on hourly or daily charts. As you can see, a very simple indicator which shows the sessions on the chart. So I can focus on higher amounts of liquidity levels as the session high and lows without searching them manually. There's nothing complicated about this indicator, very easy to use. I only use it for finding extra liquidity areas. That's it. This is the last indicator. First of all, this indicator is not essential. This is a very big and complex indicator. However, I only use this for one single purpose, showing me a vertical line at 9:30 a.m. for New York market opening. So in the settings, I have everything else disabled. I have only two things set. I check the CME open vertical line under the New York session settings. I also set the CME open hours to 9:30 a.m. That's it. I only use this indicator because I did not have a simpler one. If you have a better and much smaller indicator, please let me know about it. I will switch to that one. It only draws me a vertical line on the chart and shows me the 9:30 a.m. New York open, which I expect much higher volatility and volume on the market. This indicator is only for micro scalpers under 15 minutes. If you are larger time frame day trader or swing trader, skip this indicator. You will not need this one. So, altogether, when I open all the indicators at once, my chart will look like this. It makes me aware of all institutional levels, session levels, imbalances, and round numbers. However, the problem is I hate indicators. So there is this eye icon on the TradingView on your toolbar, which hides all the indicators. If you hover on the eye for 3 seconds, it will also show the keyboard shortcut. Basically, what I do is this: show all indicators and start marking important levels with my drawing tools. Get idea about higher amount of liquidity levels with imbalances, such as all type of inefficiencies, previous day or week highs or lows, specific round numbers, session liquidity levels, and then hide the indicators. That's it. During the day, I hide and show indicators a couple of times to be aware of these important levels. I mostly use clean charts with only price because price is the only leading indicator. If you have completed the free trading course and feel like you improved your trading skills, but you need more, an extra, a boost, and you want to move to the next level in your trading life, my masterclass is ready for you. You'll learn liquidity, inefficiencies, and structure mastery deeply. And we will look at forward and reverse trading with momentum super boxes. You will learn how to confirm your entries with magic alignment system. Finally, you'll discover a strategy called YOYO strategy, which will open new doors for you about taking and managing trades. If you are interested, you can find links on my website on the description. Take care, friends, manage your risks, and stay safe.